I'm building a terrain map of Middle-earth, complete with all of the great cities, keeps, and landmarks from the trilogy. And this project has been a wild journey in more ways than just being a creative outlet and artistic exercise. Because even though in that regard this project was challenging, it was also an unexpected escape. Because late in 2024, which is when I built this, the world has felt like a really dark place. It's dangerous, it's corrupt, and evil is taking place out in the open, unapologetically, and no one seems to be doing anything about it. And it seems like every day or every week we find ourselves 1 or 2 steps closer to a civilization-ending event. And it can feel hopeless at times. But it's in hopeless moments like these that I think stories and films like The Lord of the Rings become so important. I think this is one of the reasons that these stories mean so much to so many people on so many different levels. These books and films speak to the parts of us that want to believe there's still hope for a brighter future, that there's still goodness in the world, and as Sam said,
and it's worth fighting.
And that's where my headspace was when I was working on this project, and it's probably part of why I enjoyed it so much. For reasons more than just being a fun build, and I hope that you enjoy sharing this process and journey with me too, because this whole build began with the tracing of the great foam slabs. I started by projecting the Middle-earth map onto a big piece of foam, and I traced out all the landmarks and the shoreline, the rivers and forests. And then I cut into that foam to make the mountains, the rivers, the streams, lakes, and I labeled everything that was within this landlocked portion of Middle-earth. And I did it almost all out of foam, not unlike how many of the film's props and models were made in the trilogy. I do feel guilty that I'm working on a giant map of Middle-earth when all of these baseboards that I cut and painted for my actual house still have yet to be installed. But I don't know, maybe if this channel goes well enough, we'll tear down our house and rebuild it in the style of Gondor or Rivendell or something stupid. Something so stupid that it would be cool. But with this model just being 4 foot by 8 foot in size, it's really small compared to many of the miniatures, or bigatures as they called them, that were produced for the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And unfortunately, at this scale, it's just impossible to capture the depth of Middle-earth. But I do feel like I was at least able to bring to life some of the most iconic regions of Middle-earth to an extent. And one thing that happened during this build was finding that I began to reconnect with my childhood a lot through this model. It sounds really silly, but building up the Shire, Weathertop, the Misty Mountains really connected me to the landscape that I only watched in the films, and it connected me to these landscapes in a way that I really didn't expect to get my hands on all of this stuff. And so I decided to add character to the map by 3D printing major landmarks like cities, keeps, and strongholds of Middle-earth. I even printed the entrance to Erebor, and on top of the Lonely Mountain, there's a tiny little smog. So yeah, by the time those models are done printing, everything here will be attached to the map. I'll fit those models, and then it will be time to start putting down shrubbery and grass texture and really bringing this whole thing to life. But as it stands now, it's really cool to look at the path that the Fellowship took in the Fellowship of the Ring. These 3D printed cities and strongholds turned out so much better than I thought they would. And this was one of the most rewarding but challenging parts of the build to get right. I kept having these things break, or they would print at the wrong size. I printed again overnight and messed up with the scaling of this, but the size of these are just way too big for the scale of this map. These are way too big. You can see right there just how big the Tower of Orthanc is. I printed another one just to be safe. This is Kirithungel that broke. Then I printed some like little village houses and stuff for Bree. So I gotta resize these and reprint. One of the first pieces that came out right was the Watchtower of Amon Sul, or Weathertop. In its prime, when the Dunedain used the Watchtower, a palantir was housed here before it fell into the ruined structure that we know from the films, which is what I 3D printed for this section of the map. And I felt like this was something that I wanted to have on the map because it means a whole lot from the standpoint of the films if you're into the story of how they were made. The Watchtower of Amon Sul is actually the location of the first scene ever shot with Viggo Mortensen in the trilogy. And Mortensen was cast as Aragorn just days before filming this scene. He actually replaced Stuart Townsend, who Peter Jackson decided was a little bit too young for the role of Aragorn. So Viggo Mortensen had very little prep time and essentially jumped into filming with minimal sword training, and he absolutely crushed it. And his performance in that first fight scene, it feels like very rugged. And it kind of set the whole tone for his portrayal of Aragorn throughout the rest of the trilogy, which everybody agrees is a perfectly cast, perfectly played role. So the Watchtower of Amon Sul has a lot of meaning, not just as a location from the movie, but for what it represents in terms of the beginning of the journey of one of our favorite actors in the film, as well as one of the first key scenes for his character in that trilogy. So after roughing out all the mountain ranges, rivers, and lakes, I glued the mountains to the foam base, and then the next step is to set down plaster. And for some reason, this felt extremely nerve-wracking to me. I've never made a diorama like this before, and the mess of plastering on top of the foam that I carefully cut felt like a step that would be a project-ending disaster if handled incorrectly, but luckily, things kept looking better the further that I went. And the plaster, especially in the Misty Mountains, made everything look and feel more real rather than less, which was my worry. Now, one of my favorite scenes of the trilogy regarding the Misty Mountains is when we get to see Gandalf fall through Moria with the Balrog until the chasm that they fall through opens up to an underground lake beneath the mountain. Now, unfortunately, on this diorama, I couldn't create that section underneath the Misty Mountains, and part of me at this point wishes that I had, even if nobody would have been able to see it. Knowing that it was there would be really cool, but I guess hindsight, everything's 2020. But with hindsight being 2020, I really wish that I would have added that detail, because that's one of the things that makes the movies so fun to watch. Peter Jackson and his team referenced so much and built a world that was so detailed that there were little like Easter eggs and details that audiences wouldn't think twice about, but they put in the movies anyway to make the world feel deep, rich, and ancient. One of these design elements can be seen in Minas Morgul. The city's architecture is clearly Gondorian, but it's been outfitted with metal and its white stone has been stained, indicating that at some point in the past, the city fell into the hands of Sauron's forces. It gives off this eerie glow as well, which I tried to capture in my miniature version of Minas Morgul. And I really love how this pays homage to the detail that Peter Jackson's team put into the Minas Morgul model that we know from the films. Because the detail that they put into this model tells us as viewers that Minas Morgul probably has a tragic and violent past. And this attention to world building is also apparent in the Amon Hen ruins, as well as in the mines of Moria. And in the movies, this gives Middle-earth's landscape the sense that it almost has a memory, and I wanted to convey the same depth through this map in any way that I could without being too heavy-handed. So even though I missed an opportunity to build the underground lake that Gandalf and the Balrog fall into in the Two Towers, I do now have an opportunity to do something similar in another area on the map. And I'm going to do this by creating a little wooded area, and I'm going to put in Bilbo's trolls, which we can surmise from the films lie somewhere between the Shire and Rivendell. So after plaster, I went on to paint. and I'm amazed at how quickly this brought the entire landscape to life. I'm trying to go for as lifelike of tones and colors as possible without stripping a feeling of fantasy and wonder from the terrain on this map. This is really, really close to being done. Now it's just terrain, so grass and shrubberies that are gonna make the forests of Middle Earth, and then I'm gonna 3D print and draw label for all of the major landmarks on this map. And speaking of terrain, I've got most of the miniature keeps and cities printed and primed and ready for paint, which gave me something to do in the evenings when the sun went down and I wasn't able to work on the model. Because during the build of this terrain, I gravely underestimated how long this project would take. I thought I could get it done in like a week, but here I am starting to put down grass and forest on week 2, and I'm up against a clock because I'm building this in an unheated home office that was supposed to be completed as a workshop back in June.
So this workshop, obviously nowhere close to being finished, but one of the things that I've learned is like, if you don't just start something, even when you're not ready, it will never get done. So this will all be finished eventually. I'll show the process in the YouTube channel because it's gonna have some really elvish vibes to it.
But the home backyard office is behind, I'm behind, and it's going to be a miserable project to complete in the freezing cold if I have this go on any longer. Because winter is coming, and since there are so many fumes that come with the spray paint, glue, and resin that I'm about to pour, I can't do this in my basement, which also should have been finished a long time ago. So if things do get cold, I'm gonna have to figure out how to keep this project going, and my answer to that is maybe more nerdy than actually building this map. Because I have this, a full-length cloak fit for the likes of a ranger from the north. It's made by Nightweave, a company that my wife and I started together, and these things are incredibly soft, sensory safe, 100% designed in the US by my wife and I, and we'd love to share our love for fantasy, adventure, and comfort with you. So if you head over to nightweave.com and use Nightloot for 10% off your next order, you can get one of these things. And consider checking out the Nightweave YouTube channel that has long-form fantasy storytelling videos that we love to make, and they're only getting better. So yeah, we're fortunate enough to sponsor our own video, but enough of that. Let's now move on to pouring the resin rivers, streams, and lakes. And now that this map is starting to look like an actual thing, I can now throw on my ranger outfit with my cloak and pour over this 3D terrain map like a true Gondorian ranger deciding what the next move should be. I already have Minas Tirith, Weathertop, and Helm's Deep loosely fit onto the board, but Helm's Deep and Minas Tirith are going to require bringing more plaster out onto the board. They don't quite fit naturally, and if I do that, I might as well figure out a way to add little lights that go off one after another across this mountain range after pushing a button, starting at Minas Tirith and ending at Idris, so that whoever becomes the owner of this map someday can call for aid at the push of a button. So now I have this dilemma. That sounds like a really cool idea, but do I just keep things simple and add minimal filler mountains and terrain and just forget the lights altogether and move forward as it is, or should I try to make these lights work? So one issue is this, like I gotta figure out where to hide this. But the other issue is I gotta figure out where to run this line. Simplest way to do would be to just drill down into the foam core and have this sandwiched between this plate and the plate of foam that's gonna go underneath it. The really tricky part is I need all of these to be just a pinpoint of light that looks like a small bonfire on the top of these mountain peaks. And what I'm worried about is I can't hollow out these mountains and hide them underneath what's already here. I've got to tuck them into these crevices and then build new mountains around each one of these lights. And I've got to figure out how to make just a small pinpoint of light. Part of me wants to add the lights, but the other part of me knows that that's going to make this like a much more complicated build because I've already had some big setbacks. I had multiple 3D printed landmarks break or fail during printing in the first few rounds, which I need to reprint. And as I'm considering doing that, I'm starting to think that it would be amazing to also include other landmarks that I didn't think to in the beginning, like Lake Town below the Lonely Mountain. I want to put Smog above the Lonely Mountain as an homage to Bilbo's map of Erebor. I'd also love to put Bilbo's trolls in the forests bordering the woods of Rivendell. I still need to put in Osgiliath, Cirith Ungol, and Sauron's Tower, and if I'm feeling really ambitious and self-loathing, I could even try to model the Grey Havens as well. Like, there's a lot that I could do with this, and I kind of want to because I just love how subtle the Argonath is and how cool it looks. This is one of the most iconic landmarks in the entire trilogy. The Argonath, also known as the Pillars of the Kings, depicts Isildur and Anarion, the ancient kings of Gondor, and they mark the northern boundary of Gondor and serve as a reminder of Gondor's former glory. And I just love this landmark, and you don't notice it on the map unless you know to look for it, and I think that I can add a lot more elements like this to the map without making it feel too chewy. I love the idea of having all of these landmarks that you only notice if you're looking for them, so I think I'm gonna do it. That's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna go ahead and make this project more complicated for you, for me, and
for Frodo.
So now it's back to the 3D modeling software, the 3D printer, and paint. I'm also going to risk ruining the model and get these LEDs onto the landscape to act as the beacons of Gondor, because that's one of the most hopeful, chill-inducing moments of the entire trilogy, and I love the idea of lighting the beacons of Gondor on this map. But before I commit, I'm just going to be safe and experiment with how I can place them on here and where to hide these cords.
It's just a really big challenge because I feel like this board looks really good for my first big terrain map, and I don't want to ruin this.
In the meantime, though, it's time to place Orthanc on the map. I've made this little section around Isengard with resin to appear like it's flooded, so this snapshot of the Middle-earth map is a moment in time between the victory at Helm's Deep and the Battle of Minas Tirith. Now, one thing that I think is so cool is that Isengard was originally a Númenorian fortress that fell into ruin before Saruman took it over. And Orthanc, the Black Tower at its center, is indestructible and was said to be built using ancient techniques that even Saruman could not replicate, which is probably how it stood up to the Ents chucking stones at it in the two towers without much damage. And this decision to show a flooded Isengard also means that I need to breach Helm's Deep wall to make things more accurate. And fun fact, this Helm's Deep model took like 4 hours to print. This print is going to be done in just 4 hours. It's not a huge one. These models are tiny. But the actual filming of the Helm's Deep scene took 4 months to shoot, mostly at night. And even though conditions were awful, we wound up with what will probably always be the greatest nighttime battle scene of all time in any fantasy movie or TV show. Because almost 20 years later, when the Game of Thrones attempted the same thing with a much larger budget, they failed miserably. It's one of the worst nighttime battle scenes ever to go on film. Which is another reason that I love The Lord of the Rings so much. There was just so much love and care and attention to detail that went into this trilogy. It's a perfect trilogy. So there's one problem with this map, which I based completely off of the map from the movie that I pulled from the internet. And that is, this is Weathertop, where Frodo gets stabbed by the Ringwraiths. This river is the river where Arwen summons the water horses to wipe out the Ringwraiths. This is the only forested area between Weathertop and that river, which doesn't make sense because we know there's some sort of forested region right here where Sam points out Mr. Bilbo's trolls. So I'm going to add some woods around Weathertop as well as Bilbo's trolls. And I'm doing my very best to enjoy every moment of this Middle-earth build because I don't know when the next time is that I'll be able to revisit this universe and this world in this same way. And it makes me sad to think about finishing this map because I'm closer to the magic that I felt as a kid watching these films than I have been in decades, and it feels really comfortable and just awesome. So now that I have all of those landmarks in place and the map is looking pretty close to being completely finished, it's time for the finishing touches. I'm going to be installing the Black Gate, Cirith Ungol, Barad-dûr, Minas Morgul, Osgiliath, Minas Tirith, Helm's Deep, Lake Town, and Smog. And then there's Mount Doom. I'm sculpting this separately, and there it goes. I'm also going to place a tree on top of Hobbiton as a landmark, so that we know where Hobbiton is, because I didn't think that a little hobbit hole or Bilbo's house would look that great. I want these landmarks to be subtle, like you have to look for them, but once you see them, you can't unsee them. That's kind of what I'm going for here. So the end of this build felt really hard. It's like the last 10% of this build took the most time, and after touching up the mountain ranges, rivers, dead marshes, and newly printed landmarks, I plastered the seabed of the other half of this map. I painted the edges of the map black after my huge resin pour to create the Great Sea, and it turned out really beautiful. The color of the ocean is amazing, the shorelines in the natural sunlight look almost real, and all of the hard work and detail that went into this paid off. I'm especially in love with the miniature landmarks. I love the trolls and the buildings, and if you want a true concept of the scale of these, this is what they look like compared to a penny. The scale is so small that my camera is having a hard time properly focusing on these objects, and now that it's all over, my emotions are really mixed. Like the final scenes of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, for me, wrapping up this project is bittersweet. Like the Fellowship, I feel like I've come so far since starting out with this giant piece of foam core. It was just scribbles on a giant slab, but little by little, I saw it come to life. I saw my favorite landmarks rise up from Middle-earth, each step drawing closer to a completed piece. And strangely, this makes me sad now that it's over. Just like the films, a big part of me wishes there was more to this. How is this it? I have Lake Town, Erebor, Minas Tirith, Mount Doom, Helm's Deep, but I could have gone so much deeper. I could have put in the Watcher in the water. I could have added Lorien, details of Mirkwood. But like the real Lord of the Rings, maybe I do an extended edition of this map. I've been thinking about turning it into a table, framing it up, setting it inside of a wooden frame box with LEDs covering it around the edges, with glass on top of it to make the coolest executive desk of all time. And maybe I'll keep it for my office, or donate it to someone, or sell it. I haven't really decided, but what I do know is that I'm not the same person I was when I started this. And that might sound dramatic and stupid, but it's facts. Because this reconnected me like a lightning rod to who I was when I was younger and I first saw these films, when I almost believed that this Middle-earth and its characters were real. And back then, when I was young, I felt that anything was possible. I felt like there was always hope, that there was purpose in suffering and hardship if you stayed true to who you were and chose to do good. Back then, I felt like there was some good left in the world, and that was worth fighting for. But I grew up, like we all do, and I forgot. And the pessimist inside of me started to grow, and I lost faith in people. I lost faith in myself. And somehow this silly little project reminded me that the sun is always going to rise again, and a new day will come. And if it has any hope of shining out clearer in the future than it shines today, it's only going to be so because of good people like you and like me. And that goodness that brings a brighter tomorrow, that's a choice that we all make every day. And this project reminded me that what we choose to do with the time that is given to us has real impact on the world and the people around us. While working on this map, I was reminded of one of the most beautiful and real lines in all of cinema and fantasy history. The reality that
even the smallest person can change the course of the future.
So I get that this is just a map. It's not going to change the world, but the lessons in the story that inspired the map can. So thanks for spending 20 minutes with me. And for more nerdcraft videos like this, you can follow for more. And for fantasy lore and storytelling videos, check out the Nightweave channel. We'd love to see you there. We'll see you next time.